Hi and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So this is the special CHC COVID support session for social housing. It's all about keeping tenants safe. My name's Melanie Harding. I am Head of Marketing and Communications for One Team Logic. So those of you who don't know us, we're the makers of My Concern safeguarding software and services. We've got a lovely panel with us here today, so I just want to make sure if we can have a show of hands from our audience, just to make sure that everybody can see our lovely panelists and you can hear us okay. You should be able to raise your hand just to show. Yeah, I've got a couple of hands raised. That's lovely. I'll just put those down. Thank you very much. So we've got a few bits of housekeeping today. We will be recording the session. So I think we've had a few people who have been unable to make it, so we'll make sure that we send out a recording afterwards. So there'll be lots of useful information, hopefully, that you can take from it, and you'll have that on demand. Everybody will be on mute apart from our panelists, but you do have the opportunity to ask any questions. So there's a chat function in your control panel. We'll be taking questions right the way throughout. So if you've got any that you kind of think of right away, we'll be taking them from the off. So please do submit any questions through the session. Any ones that we don't manage to get through to, we will try and send them on a follow-up email. We'll ask our experts and obviously send any follow-ups. We've got a few panels. We've got a few polls that will be going on today. So that's just really to get a lay of the land, understand a little bit more about how you're feeling and what you're experiencing in the housing sector. So please do participate in those. If you have phoned in, you won't be able to vote, but if you have logged on via a computer, you should be able to do that. And again, you'll be able to vote using your control panel. So there's a drop-down section. Just wanted to say that this there a little bit of a health check. There might be some sensitive topics that could be triggers for some people, but it's a really safe space to air any views. Any questions you'll be asked will be completely anonymous, and there is no such thing as a silly question. So please do submit all of those. So that's all for the housekeeping bit. There will be a survey at the end of the session, so please do feed that, answer that survey. It'll be launched after the fact. We just want to see if this has been useful for you, and again, you have the opportunity to ask any questions. So I will just go on to make a quick introduction now of our panelists. So we've got Mike Glanville. So Mike is Director of Safeguarding Services for One Team Logic. And Mike, do you want to give us a short spiel about your background?
Hi everybody, good afternoon. Yes, yeah, I'm one of the co-founders of One Team Logic, and as some of you will know, we're actually a safeguarding company based in Talbot Green near Cardiff, and I'm the Director of Safeguarding Services for OTL. But my background is actually in policing, so I was a senior police officer for many years down in Dorset, with a responsibility for both adults at risk and vulnerable children, and I also sat on the local Safeguarding Children's Board in Dorset as well, and I also happen to be a chair of school governors as well in Dorset. Thanks, Mel.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike. Just going on to Jan. So Jan Pickles, Safeguarding Trustee Board member, but has also got wealth of experience. Could you just tell us a little bit about your background, Jan?
Probation officer originally, ended up then moving to using all the risk approach in domestic abuse and moving to working with victims from working with perpetrators. And then I worked at the NSPCC and did my career as assistant PCC at South Wales for the South Wales Force. But since then I work as a consultant in a range of historical child sex abuse inquiries, domestic homicide reviews, child death reviews, and I sit on the National Safeguarding for Wales.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jan. We've got Debbie Gardner today as well. Debbie is a safeguarding trainer for My Concern. Debbie, do you want to explain a little bit about your background, please?
Yeah, hi, my name's Debbie Gardner. I'm part of the safeguarding team. My background is also in policing, where I spent 30 years with South Wales Police. The last 10 years, I worked in the Cwmtaf area, based at Pontypridd. I was one of the key decision makers in MASH, where I would chair some of the daily domestic abuse strategy discussions and sometimes stand in for the DI as the MARAC chair as well. Since my retirement from the police, I've done some safeguarding training with Cwmtaf and delivered domestic abuse training for the training department for that area. Okay.
Wonderful, thank you. And last but by no means least, Will Henson. As Will is Policy and External Affairs Manager at CHC. Will, over to you.
Hi everyone, I cover housing management and supported housing for CHC. I also hold the position of Vice Chair at the Woolwich, which is Wales's largest homelessness service provider. My background is in homelessness and housing policy.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So we have run a few of these sorts of sessions with some of the other sectors that we work in. So we're just going to run through some agreed topics, and as I said, please do submit any questions that you've got. So Jan, I think you're going to start off by giving us a little bit of a background on the scene at the moment and what it's looking like out there for housing and in social housing.
Well, I'm not an expert on social housing, though I did spend 5 years on the Link board, so I do understand how a housing association works, and I know more about gearing than is good for a person to know. So the bigger picture in Wales is that obviously we were initially, all of the planning has been done through a range of bronze, silver and gold, and hopefully your organisations have been involved. And if not, that's a valuable bit of learning for how people get involved in future. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we won't have a future pandemic, in future crises. Because my belief is that housing, and I know this from having sat in years of MARACs, housing are the people who know. They know who's in a house, who's visiting, when a child who's, you know, there on the third Saturday every, you know, across the whole of the year is there. They'll often know who's vulnerable in a house, who's risky, and they will have, by the nature of your contact with people, will have seen families as a whole rather than as individuals, which many other agencies only see an individual member. They don't see that dynamic of a family working together. So what's been happening in Wales is we had a massive decrease in referrals, a bit like what happened in A&E. Everyone was so worried they didn't go to A&E. People didn't go to their GP. Well, we weren't picking up referrals in terms of children at risk, and we weren't seeing domestic abuse calls. However, in England, they were, and there was a massive peak in domestic abuse calls. Now, that's been a real concern for us in Wales. So do people who are at risk and trapped in a family home and trapped in that family unit and are fearful, have they got anywhere to go? So there's been, subsequent to the initial planning, there's been recent campaigns, and people have seen, you know, encouraging people to go into boots, there's code words, there's all sorts of strategies in play now. But initially, we were in a position where we saw a massive drop-off in referrals. Safeguarding referrals, because clearly schools are a big referrer. And Operation Encompass, where the schools receive notification the police have been on a domestic the previous evening, and they receive it that following morning, is now talking about how we can bring organisations together as children return, as and when children return to school. So overall, it's been a bit of a scary picture, because we all know in our own families we've been under massive pressure, and that the schisms and splits and the irritations can get blown out of proportion. Well, you do that with a family that haven't got resource, have got all sorts of other pressures, then we've got real issues. The other thing that's been of real concern has been the number of online child sex offences, which have a massive increase in both in people generating images and sharing images. We've also got a different approach in terms of county lines, with them using vans now, delivery vans. So is the Amazon van in your road delivering a parcel, or is it delivering something else? So organised crime seem to have adapted very quickly in a way that we've been a bit slower to it, I think. And it just shows you how good their business model is. And clearly that's happening on where your housing is. So eyes and ears are really critical, and housing provides a massive function in that.
Thanks for your insight. Really, really interesting. And Mike, from conducting, I've mentioned that we've done these kind of sessions in other sectors and other industries. What are your common themes and your key takeaways for safeguarding the vulnerable during lockdown?
Yeah, well, as you know, Mel, we've been running regular weekly sessions with schools right across the UK, so including schools from Wales, on this issue. And I mean, what we've found is that some of the things that Jan's just mentioned there are very, very kind of similar, because a lot of the children, the vulnerable children, are going to be living in social housing. And one of the big problems, I think, is, how do you, in this sort of situation, get yourself into a position where you're able to monitor vulnerability and risk. So that's been a really big challenge, I think, for a lot of the schools. So a lot of safeguarding leads are talking to us about their anxiety in not being able to make contact with children that are vulnerable. And the issue of domestic abuse is clearly a big issue. And we know that children living with households where domestic abuse is present are more likely to suffer from neglect issues. So that's a big concern. And we also know that mental health is a big issue, again, particularly with households where you have children living with parents or living with other adults in the household, where mental health is an issue. And we know from the referrals that are going into a lot of the services that mental health is certainly one of the big concerns as well. I think one of the factors, I think, is around how we're managing risk in terms of the risk management process. There's been quite a bit of confusion, I think, across a lot of organisations about how they should do that. So that's one of the issues. And then also, how do you retain communication, between the agencies and with those households that need support. So again, I think that's another big issue. So there are a lot of lessons, I think, coming out of the last 8 weeks or so, both in England and in Wales. And I think, in terms of being able to manage safeguarding well, I think, one of the really tricky issues, I think, for staff involved in these organisations is how do you do that remotely? Is something I think we'll probably come on to later on in this discussion. But I think that certainly has been an issue which has been flagged up by many safeguarding leads, is they're having some real challenges in terms of managing their kind of day-to-day safeguarding practice from home, and that's a big challenge for them. Great,
thanks, Mike. I think we're going to launch our first poll. So if we can do that. So this first poll is really, what are your main concerns about the safety of your tenants? We know that there's actually a lot of things that we could have put in this list. So we've tried to whittle them down, but we just want to get a feeling for if you're thinking it's a lot around domestic violence that you're seeing or privy to at the moment. It might be that you have concerns about children, or is it more mental health? So that might include self-neglect, as we've been hearing quite a lot about that. Or is it antisocial behaviour? Or is there maybe something else on that list that's the main cause of concern for you? So we're just going to wait for everyone to vote. Got quite a few people voted. Just give it another minute or so. I I think sometimes there's a little delay on these sessions, so I just want to give everyone the opportunity to be able to vote there. Okay, so if you could launch the responses. So I think that's really interesting. So I was watching those votes coming in, and for quite a long time it was neck and neck between domestic violence and mental health. But obviously mental health has pipped the post there. Will, is this reflective of your discussions with your members?
Yeah, I think it's difficult, isn't it, to pick just one of these as always, but particularly on the mental health area, this isn't a specific COVID issue. This has existed, since time began, really, and particularly access to local health board services as they become increasingly stretched due to underfunding and under-resourcing, particularly of mental health services. I think what's happened here is this, in so many ways, the current situation has brought to light existing issues. And mental health is certainly one of those. I can see that obviously domestic violence and ASB are quite close behind as well. And again, hearing a lot from our member housing associations around the particularly removal of certain tools in terms of addressing ASB, but also obviously the additional stress that tenants are placed under, and also the inability for survivors of and people who are currently experiencing domestic violence to be able to be out of their homes, and to be able to kind of give those excuses that they potentially were able to before. So I think that does look very representative.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. If we just close that screen now. Thank you. So just a question for Jan, really. What advice would you give to housing officers who might be coming into contact with either victims of domestic abuse or issues with mental health? What would those?
Well, it's always never keep it to yourself, because you'll know one piece of the information. But I don't think you can underestimate how valuable the piece of information that you've got, because of the lack of contact services are having. So people with mental health, anxiety, depression, and other diagnoses will have been having support from their GPs. And it's likely that they won't be having face-to-face now with their GPs. It would be very unlikely if they were. Hopefully they're having telephone calls. But so that your call, it's that every contact counts, and that you're part of a wider team now. Your job isn't just about housing. Your job is much wider than that, because you will have a valuable piece of information there, and it's important to get shared. Now, the mashes, I did say my dog was going to bark at a key moment, and he's on cue.
Usually mine.
He's got yeah, so for me, the really important thing is, besides shutting that dog up, is not underestimating the power of the information that you have and sharing it.
Okay, brilliant. And did you want to add to that, Mike?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that one of the challenges, I think, for a lot of organisations, not just housing, is how do you avoid under-reporting, and are you actually reporting enough information, and understanding just how important that is, because it's the information itself which is the kind of early warning system, isn't it, in terms of being able to spot signs and symptoms, when there is a problem. And a lot of case practice reviews, serious case reviews from the past will say that one of the big challenges is in terms of how organisations are recording information, and what they call low-level concerns is I think a big part of that. And organisations just need to understand how important those apparently small and apparently insignificant things are when it comes to the bigger picture. Because as Jan said, you're part of a much bigger team in a sense. Safeguarding is not is not kind of carried out in a bubble. You know, you are part of a wider safeguarding team, which is all of the agencies, and that you know, pulling that information together is just so important, particularly in, I think, a situation like this, where all of the resources are stretched. Everybody's finding it difficult to properly risk assess and properly identify vulnerability. So everybody's got a role to play, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. Debbie, I know that you've obviously got quite a lot of experience with this and domestic violence and victims and managing that. What can we do to help manage this? What's your advice?
Okay, so obviously, you know, we know what the figures are, and certainly there shouldn't have been any surprise, because, you know, in other countries such as China, Italy, Spain, they've all reported the same issues with this, you know, increase in domestic abuse. And we also know that, you know, the home is quite a dangerous place. On average, 2 women are killed per week by their partner, and 75% are killed in their own home. So, you know, there are real issues here. And with the social increased isolation, social distancing, obviously, you know, it can escalate the issues with people who are living with an abusive partner. Not to mention any economic stresses and fears about the virus as well. We've already mentioned people aren't comfortable maybe going to A&E and they're staying away, so that's also an issue. I saw something quite interesting that I thought I'd share. Was a report that Safe Lives collaborated with, and it has some findings on what housing providers should look for. And some of them I'll read out. It says existing or increasing rent arrears. Victims or survivors are 7 times more likely to be in rent arrears of over £1,000 than people not experiencing domestic abuse. Any damage to the property, we know that is an obvious one. Repair call-outs, particularly damage to the property, you know, holes in the walls, repairs to doors and windows, etc. Requests for lock changes or enhanced security or replacement keys. Noise nuisance complaints. Police call-outs, neighbours reporting concerns, substance misuse, and it's a sense that something isn't quite right. So it's on that note, it's interesting to see how things are labelled as well in terms of antisocial behaviour. Some of those things that could be an indicator of domestic use may be labelled as an antisocial behaviour. So that might need to be looked at, because we don't want to rule out domestic abuse and miss the factor that there's somebody that may need some assistance there. I think most of the domestic abuse services are now continuing to deliver services and are stepping up to the challenge of expanding their contact and online support services. And, you know, certainly with sort of Welsh Women's Aid have done a toolkit for the people. There's a lot of good advice and stuff online that people can dig out as well. I think the biggest problem, obviously, is how we communicate with people at a time when everyone's in isolation. And the biggest thing, I suppose, is being able to get over that, the Live Fear Free helpline number, that people can get support. And being aware that obviously, you know, people might not want to be overheard if they are experiencing abuse in the home, and they may be monitored, and so any conversations are going to be restricted in that sense. So I suppose it's about thinking about outside the box a little bit. Maybe, you know, in the cars you could put the number, or in a poster in an office or a window. You can include the number on an email signature, and share it amongst your staff when you have your meetings, on your conference calls. You know, put it on your web pages, etc. Whether you've got any leaflets going out to, you know, with a range of support services that you could possibly put something on there. And I suppose if you've got, you know, depending on what you've done, I know some of the housing agencies have actually made phone calls out to all their sort of known domestic abuse, or households where they believe that domestic abuse is undergoing there. And sometimes, you know, you can do a disruption sort of thing by, you know, maybe taking daily phone calls or delivering food parcels, and that can disrupt perpetrators' behaviour, because they know they are being monitored as well. And I think the other thing is just, finding out any other local support within your area, and if you can, safely pass that on. There are other things like the apps, the Bright Sky app as well. If people don't already know about it, it's worth downloading. It's free to download, and it offers a UK-wide directory of specialist domestic abuse support services. It's also available in 4 languages, English, Urdu, Punjabi and Polish. And it basically looks like a weather app on somebody's phone. So some of those things might be helpful.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Debbie. I should have mentioned actually that we'll make sure that those resources you mentioned, we'll send them out in the follow-up email, so that everybody who didn't manage to scribble them down quickly can have access to them. So I think there's some really useful advice in there. Thank you. Brilliant. Okay, we've just had a question come in here, or a statement really. So I couldn't agree more about sharing information. We as an organisation are struggling with ISPs. What can we sign up to comply with GDPR? And are other organisations finding this? I think, Mike, that one for you?
Yeah, I mean, the guidance I think is actually quite clear now, because with the introduction of GDPR and with the updated Data Protection Act 2018, both in a way are just providing a framework to enable that information sharing to take place. And it's quite often it's having the confidence in the legislation and the confidence in your understanding of the legislation to actually be able to share information with other agencies, and understand that actually the guidance is very much encouraging and promoting you to be able to do that. What is important when it comes to data security and with any kind of information sharing is that you've got good protocols in place, particularly if you're sharing information with the other agencies. So I think that's really important, and also that your staff, that every single member of staff in your organisation understands how far they can go and what they need to be thinking about when they're sharing information with other agencies, and also when they're sharing information within the organisation itself. That's the other important part of that. You also need to be thinking about your tenants, and making sure that the communication in terms of any data storage, or any processing of data, or the sharing of information, all that is really clearly understood by your tenants. So good privacy notices should be in place as well. All of that is important. So I think in terms of just having confidence in the guidance itself, it's all there. I think it's just a question of just putting in place good policy and good protocols when you are sharing information with other agencies. But if it's safeguarding information that you're sharing, there is some very specific guidance in place now that encourages agencies to be able to do that.
Brilliant, thank you. And just on that second part of that question, Will, it said, are other organisations finding this? Is that your experience, that lots of organisations are feeling under strain of this?
Yeah, I think it's always difficult, isn't it, particularly if you're not an expert in safeguarding or in dealing with ASB, to know exactly what you can say to different people. And I think we all experience it in different parts of our jobs. And I think that's where having that specific training is really important, but also having those links with named people within the different services that you're working with, because I think what we find in any area of cooperation is that people are working with people rather than with actual bodies or organizations. So I think it's about having those links on an interpersonal basis, because then you can ask what maybe would be seen as possibly a stupid question in an easier way.
Yeah, sure, brilliant, thank you. I think we might go to our second poll now. So we would like to kind of follows nicely on really. So how effective are you finding multi-agency working? So you might be working really effectively with them, might be effective but need some improvements. It might not be working effectively. And I apologise, I didn't give instructions on how to vote. So you can actually vote using, rather than clicking on your screen, it's actually in the control panel. So there is a drop down, or there's an area that says polls, and it will give you the options in which you can choose there. And whilst I'm waiting for the results of those to come in, or for people to vote, just want to remind people that they can submit questions. I've had a couple come through already, so please just submit your questions to our panel, and we will do our best to answer them. So let's just see how many people are voting. So we've got about 58%. So if we just wait till we get 60% of people to vote, just so everyone knows, we've got about 45 people on the call today. That's a good number. Brilliant. Okay, if we can launch those results. So I think that's interesting. Mike, what would you like to say about that?
I think that's pretty typical, actually, of multi-agency working. I think generally the agencies work pretty well together, particularly in England, across England and Wales. I've seen, really good examples of some, great, collaboration with the agencies. But there's always this feeling that we could do better, that things could be improved. I think particularly when it comes to information sharing and being clear about the needs of other organisations. I think one of the challenges of multi-agency working is actually just understanding how each organisation can have different priorities. They can work very differently, and I think for housing especially, housing have got a critical role, I think, in safeguarding, in the sense that very often it's the housing officers and indeed sometimes even the tenants themselves that are right at the front line of safeguarding, in terms of understanding actually what's going on inside some of these households. And for the other agencies, that information is critically important. And I think housing sometimes can be frustrated if sometimes their information is just not getting through for whatever reason, or they're finding it difficult with the referral process. We quite often hear that as a major concern on occasions, when other agencies tend to have other priorities, and other agencies are trying to push referrals through social care or through the police, and that can sometimes be a major barrier. So yeah, the results there don't surprise me at all, Mel.
Brilliant. We've had, it's not so much of a question, more of a statement really, but someone's mentioned that they're finding information is actually being shared with other organisations that it shouldn't be. So all housing providers are receiving information on cases, so potentially they're not even their tenants. So I think that's a really interesting point. That's probably, it comes about in schools as well, doesn't it, Mike?
It does. Yeah, I mean, if you're sharing information, it does need to be, and there's a question of proportionality and necessity. So, and that's really important when you're looking to share information, that you've got a good rationale for doing it and it's properly justified. So, kind of blanket sharing of information is never advisable. It does need to be specifically targeted.
It also stops you finding the needle in your own haystack. Because if you're getting a blanket email about lots of people who aren't relevant to you, actually the one that is relevant to you can get lost in that. So, you're taking a risk. It shouldn't be happening, but it also undermines what you're doing, the effectiveness of what you're doing.
Absolutely. I suppose it highlights having good systems in place. If you have a system that you can actually record concerns and share it with the appropriate people, much better than kind of making do with other systems and which potentially don't have the right levels of security around them. Okay.
Absolutely.
That people are passing up, so that when we first started doing maths, we would receive a huge amount of information within the police, and the reason we began to share it from police officers on domestics who'd done the calls, completed a dash and had all of that information, the reason we shared it was to make sure that it wasn't just our responsibility, it was everybody's responsibility. And what's happened over the 15 years of Marek is that we've refined that now, and that we're not in that position. So the right information going to the right person is really key, and it's good governance. It's making sure that good governance is in place. So if that's happening, it suggests to me that there's a massive strategic gap then, because we should never be just shooting out information generally. This is people's it's the worst day of their life that you're telling other people about, and we have to do that with, we have to be values driven, and that has to be done with great care and dignity. If you think about somebody, an elderly person who's not coping and not, maintaining their dignity in all of this is really key. So we need to tell the right people, and the right people are the people who can make a difference. And housing, as you say, are the difference. So, for instance, when Debbie talked about food parcels, there's, it's not about delivering the food parcel, it's about the contact, about how that contact happens. So leaving it on a doorstep and running off is not an ideal situation. So if someone's delivering a food parcel, they need to know that their job is not to getting the food parcel across the threshold, but having the conversation. And you can do that, even though it's never going to be intimate, 6 feet across on somebody's doorstep. Is better than nothing.
Brilliant, thank you. So got a question come in here, and I think this is probably best placed to Debbie. So what advice would you give to people who are struggling to work with the MASH or have a lack of response from them due to workload?
Okay, so I think when we talked about earlier about documenting all your concerns, and the little pieces to form the full jigsaw, every piece will help get that bigger picture. That's really important. And when you're pulling all those concerns together, I think it's important that you check all your records to make sure that there may be something significant, either recent or even a historical event that's logged that may be relevant. So my point is, the more information and evidence you have to support your concern, the better it's going to be, and easier for you to sort of professionally challenge. If you give half the picture and then you complain that it's not that concern isn't being taken forward, and then later, but this all happened as well, that people are making decisions on the information in front of them. So you really need to be mindful of that, and make sure when you submit your referral that you're giving the full picture, that you've added all the information that's going to be relevant, because somebody has to make a decision on that bit of information, and they're not going to know everything else. Yeah, they're gonna check their own systems, and basically that's what MASH is about. All the partners in the MASH will check their systems and add to that bigger picture. I think the other thing as well is, within households, you've got, there may be an obvious domestic abuse incident that you feel is a Marek referral, but there may be children there as well. There may be adults at risk in the house. So consider the bigger picture as well, because even though they all have sort of different pathways within the MASH, they should all be pulled together. So if there's domestic abuse and children have witnessed it, it may be a child protection concern as well. If there's an adult at risk or an older person, it may be domestic abuse, but it may be a referral into adult services. So again, think about those bigger pictures, because they'll each be picked up, and that's going to help obviously with your referral going forward into that household.
Debbie, we've just had a quick question, so just a little bit more of an explanation around what the MASH is and what it stands for and what it does.
Okay, so not every area has one. I came from the Cwmtaf area where we had a MASH, and that stands for Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub. So I know there's one in Cardiff, and there's one in, well, Bridgend is now linked with Cwmtaf, but not every area has one. So, but the processes will be the same regardless of whether you've got a MASH or not. But basically a MASH is where all the agencies, you'll have police, probation, local authority children's services, adult services, and domestic abuse staff. I think we have Bernardo's are in there as well. We'll all be sat and sort of co-located. So when referrals come in, there's joint decision making to be had. If you haven't got a MASH, all those things will still happen, but they happen individually with phone calls, etc. Whereas in the MASH, they all happen face to face. So go back to the question. If there are disagreements, obviously, you need to inform your own line manager. Consider bringing it to the attention of the team manager. So if you're speaking to the local authority, somebody from either adult services or children's services, try and get through to the team manager of the team that's responsible for whoever's made that decision. Higher than that, you can bring it to the attention of the senior manager within social services who's got responsible for safeguarding in that area. If you're unable to resolve those, then each safeguarding board has a protocol to resolve professional differences. So if the matter cannot be resolved, then the disagreement should be addressed using the resolution of professional concerns and differences protocol. So each, as I say, each area will have that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Debbie. Just conscious of time, we always have a lot of questions that get submitted. We are planning on finishing at 1:45. We might run over a few minutes. But just a question to Jan here. So just regarding obviously workload, everybody's got a huge workload on at the moment. What do you think are the main challenges for agencies during this situation? And how can they make sure that effective safeguarding continues throughout the difficulties?
Well, initially, at the start of this, we were planning for how we'd function with 50% staff, 60%, and even the worst case scenario, 20% staff. And obviously, you're triaging all the time, you're managing risk, you're putting together these pieces of the jigsaw. So clearly, resources will follow risk. So that bigger picture that Debbie's describing, that all of the information that you've got is really key for your concern to get to the top of the pile. But if it doesn't, then escalate. Strategically, we have agreements across multi-agencies that should do that. The main thing for me for housing associations is that you've got two things that you can do. And the first of that is about your comms. So are you talking to the children in your homes? On this call, it shocked me that no one put child protection up as an issue. So are you communicating with the children? Are you hearing their voices? We know that out there's been a massive increase in the number of children generating images, sexual images of themselves and putting them on the net. Are you talking to their parents about that increase and about the increased risk? And are you talking to children about it? You have got brilliant comms. And the other thing that you can do is that you've got historical records that go back and show patterns. And it's a low-level concerns issue. It's always, when I do a review when someone's died or something serious has happened, it's obvious in hindsight, and it's never about blame, but it's piecing together those tiny little bits. And you've got brilliant records, and you've also got an ability to communicate. So let's just make sure that you're communicating with everybody within the household, not just the one person who's your tenant. A tenant is a family, and it's important that we talk to everyone. So those would be my wishes, really.
Brilliant. No, that's really, really interesting. I think we could talk about this all afternoon, quite frankly, but I'm just conscious of time. I just wanted to really finish. We've got a couple of questions that we haven't managed to get to, but I just really wanted to finish and just ask the audience really, and we're not going to launch the last poll because I don't think we've got time to, but we just wanted to get really what are some of the lessons that you've learned in relation. So this is just an open question to the audience. If you can type it in your chat feature, what are the lessons you've learned in relation to safeguarding and the safety of your tenants during lockdown? What are the positives that you've taken out of it, and maybe what are some of the areas for improvement? I think it would just be really nice to understand that from some of our people out there listening to us. So I'll wait for them to come in with some of their suggestions. Oh, here we go. We've got one. Keeping in touch via phone has been well received and really important. So I think that's, yeah, I think all methods of communication, certainly we've had lots and lots of use of video that's really helped people, so that's great. We've had another comment here, don't be afraid to ask. I think that's really pertinent. Certainly we've had a lot of questions, haven't we, Mike and Debbie?
Yeah.
We've had another positive here, providing regular contact, giving numbers to contact, and no issue too small for us to assist you. That's a really nice positive piece of feedback. And is there any kind of any final thoughts on this panel that you would like to share?
My view would be about how we look after you as staff, because you're probably me sat at your kitchen table, you've probably got your family all around, including a noisy dog, but you may also have children at the end doing the end of the table doing the homework, and we're expecting you to deal with really difficult situations. You don't know which call's going to blow up. Normally people who could be very nice to you can become very hostile in this situation because we're all in fear. So it's something about looking after staff, I think, because you don't have to work a full day, just do what you can do, make that contribution that you're already making, but do look after your own mental health and your own family in this.
I think that's a great point, Jan, because in fact I was actually on a call with a safeguarding lead from a housing association just recently on a video conference call, and that what you described there was exactly what I could see. Working from home, family all around. In fact, we had young sort of 2-3-year-old daughter on her knee as we were having this conversation, and yeah, so working under those circumstances can be really, really difficult. And I think some of the lessons coming out of all of this is around how we kind of make it much easier for staff to be able to manage safeguarding from home when we need to. So I think having really good systems in place, being really, really understanding what it means to have to be able to manage secure, sensitive data when you're at home. You cannot manage that stuff on your home computers. You cannot manage that stuff on spreadsheets and email. It has to be done professionally, and there are ways in which you can achieve that. How you are sharing information with your own colleagues and how you're doing that with other agencies from home is also critical. You need access to data. You need access to intelligence around safeguarding. So how are you going to do that from home, and how are your staff going to be able to do that from home? So I think there's a lot of learning, actually. I think there are some really good things about working from home. And I think what we found is that actually, in some respects, it actually can make you a lot more efficient. You're not spending so much time on the road. You're not having to go to, having to attend, various meetings on site and that kind of thing. So, but you do need the tools and you need the right kit to be able to make yourself efficient, and you need to understand what you can and cannot do. So I think for staff, that's really important.
Brilliant. Any final comments? Well, Debbie?
Well, I think, you talk about looking after yourself, and, don't forget domestic abuse affects everybody. So, we're talking about your clients, but don't forget you may have colleagues out there as well. So if you pick up anything at all, then, you need to sort of be mindful of that.
Brilliant. We've had some lovely other comments as well, which I'm sure we'll send out because actually, and they'll be anonymous, but actually there's some really lovely comments that people have been doing and taking away. Will, I'll leave you with the final remarks to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all obviously really important points. We're all working from home, so obviously I'm not dealing with the kind of emotionally tasking issues that some others are dealing with. But I think the final point I'd like to make is hopefully we will be moving over the next few weeks and possibly months into bringing back some level of face-to-face working. So I think it's how we go about that and how we approach. I've been approached by a number of housing associations saying in some safeguarding issues and some ASB issues that they cannot be resolved without some kind of face-to-face contact. So I think that's the next discussion. Obviously, we're still in the crisis mode of adapting our working methods to not being able to do face-to-face, but also how do we safely go back to actually doing that face-to-face, because hopefully we will be able to return to that at some point.
Sure. Great, thank you. I'm aware that we've overrun, we've gone over by 7 minutes, so sorry about that. As I mentioned before, there's a survey, so if you can make sure that you complete that. For those of you who do want to find us, our website is myconcern.co.uk, and we're available if you've got any questions about safeguarding. You can of course send them to CHC as well, and we will be happy to get in contact with you about that. And yeah, that's everything. We will make sure that we send the recording, and we will make sure that we send any links to any resources as well. Thank you ever so much for participating today, and we hope you have a lovely day. Thanks all.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks everybody.